Thank you, sir. We've just discussed our preferred order, and I think Mr. Bonner's got the list there. With your leave, sir, I think it'll roll out best if we go with Ms. Ryder to start with, then Mr. Shaw, Mr. Lewis, Ms. Phillips, Mr. Osborne, and then Mr. Bonnis, and I'll go last, and I'll be in your hands as to whether you've got questions for me or whether you simply want me to make some observations.
Great, thank you very much.
Good morning. My name's Rebecca Ryder. I'm a landscape architect. Obviously, I've introduced myself before. I have prepared a summary expert statement to encapsulate my role in summary of my evidence in chief, and I think I'll move through to, if you agree, to paragraph 7 of the summary statement, because the others are effectively summary points that may be helpful to you in deliberations. At 7, the summary seeks to summarise the rebuttal evidence iteration of the proposed plan change. In order to respond to Ms. Monsengo's rebuttal, these summaries, I summarise them, sorry, that's bad English, in the order of items recorded in our joint witness statement as being responded to her in her rebuttal. So in the joint witness statement, we spoke to several matters, site-specific values, and these were the matters that were to be responded to in Ms. Monsengo's rebuttal. And I'm just confirming that the site-specific values, item 2, which was a matter to be responded to, she provided sufficient information, in my view, and addressed the site-specific values appropriately. At landscape effects, at item 2, Ms. Monsengo included a revised Appendix 8 to address the further precision in terms of plan mechanisms. In my opinion, these suitably address the landscape and effects and outcomes for the residential zone, and Appendix 8 addresses this appropriately. I remain concerned around the parameters or lack of that it sets for the access road. It remains silent on future assessment to ensure the effects are minimised. Sorry, it remains reliant on the future assessment to ensure the effects are minimised and that the vegetation removal is minimised. At her paragraph 45, under cumulative effects, Ms. Monsengo states that the access road would be assessed when more information is available. In my view, there could be outcomes in Appendix 8 that could seek to visually screen the road from the views from Lake Taupo or retain the vegetated escarpment as a dominant feature, etc. Appendix 8 does not include parameters to benching or planting as methods to managing effects of an unknown road design. It does, however, include vegetation along the road corridor, but does not depict the benching design shown in the visual simulation. The unknown extent of vegetation clearance currently, or management of that extent, is where I have the remaining concern. I recognise the difficulty of determining an unknown design. However, the outstanding landscape area 60 remains outstanding, and to ensure adverse effects remain low, understanding the methods is, in my opinion, important. These are important to ensuring that the proposed road retains a low adverse effects level and is responsive to the values of the OLA 60. To this point, managing the extent of clearance within the area of OLA 60 could be clearly defined. Under natural character effects, item 1, Ms. Monsengo provides an assessment of natural character using the landscape framework of table 2-2 of the Waikato Regional Policy Statement. This, in my view, is a landscape assessment which includes consideration of naturalness. Ms. Monsengo concludes that the road will create a localised loss of natural character and that the bridge will not create significant adverse effects on natural character of Lake Taupo and its margins. She concludes that it is appropriate to assess the effects at the time of resource consent. I summarise that the natural character effects have been assessed by Ms Monzingo as outlined in the joint witness statement, and that she relies on Appendix 8 to provide further precision in the terms of the plan mechanisms to ensure that the proposed mitigation will be successfully implemented. Similar to the landscape effects in the OLA 60, Appendix 8 demonstrates under Schedule 1 planting areas 7 and 8, which show roadside planting within the road and bridge corridor. The additional matters of control include effects on natural character, and required outcomes seek to minimise the development footprint of the bridge and road as far as practicable, and that they are designed to minimise adverse effects. Here is where my only concern with regard to appropriate measures remains. The intent to minimise adverse effects does not, in my opinion, have a clear measure of the acceptable level of effect for this OLA and its natural character values. By this I mean that the road design may not be practicably able to retain adverse effects to a low degree, even with mitigation. At this point, I consider that there are measures available that could provide more certainty to a resource consent process of what an appropriate degree of modification to the OLA 60 is acceptable. These approaches have been outlined in discussion of the visual simulations and in Schedule 1. The main methods I consider could be included, as I have raised earlier, surround vegetation clearance and earthworks. At this point, the approach to the residential area and OLA 60 are different in the level of certainty that they provide for managing assessed effects. I am of the view that the proposed plan change will integrate the landscape character and visual amenity. However, I remain concerned on the lack of understanding of how effects will be managed for the proposed access road.
Thank you very much for that. I'll see if we have questions for you. Roseanne, start at your end.
Good morning, Ms Ryder. Just a very quick question from me. It's just on your very last point in the statement you've just presented to us. You comment that you remain concerned on the lack of understanding of how effects will be managed for the proposed access road. In your mind and in your professional opinion, what might be done to build that understanding from your perspective?
Well, probably going back a step, the joint witness statement, we agreed at what scale to assess that the landscape, the outstanding natural landscape. And we agreed that would be within about a 3 kilometre radius, and Ms Monzingo has provided that in her assessment. In that, it considers what role that outstanding landscape has within that localised area or intermediate area. So going back to your question around understanding how you can manage the effects, it's understanding at what point do you hit that tipping point of the inappropriateness, and the effects are more or minor, more than minor. We don't use those terms. Our terms are sitting on a 7-point scale from very low to very high, moderate being in the middle. And at the moment, the initial assessment was that at a localised level, the effects would be high, and that at a broad scale, there would be no effect. And currently, the assessment from Ms Monzingo is that the effects at the localised scale, there would be no effect. But I have trouble with that statement in the fact that we don't know the parameter of the road design and the extent of clearance, or any way of managing that to know at what point we hit that tipping point. I'm not asking and saying that we need to have a finalised road design, but understanding how those values input into that outcome, in my view, is important at this point.
Kia ora, thanks for that. A couple of questions. The vegetated, at number 7, you talk about the second paragraph of landscape effects. You talk about the retained vegetated escarpment as the dominant feature. Now, there was confusion yesterday around the mapping and which area you're talking about. When you say vegetated, not what you were talking about, we were talking about. When you say vegetated escarpment, which area are you referring to?
I am talking about the area presenting toward the lake. So where the road is proposing to cut across and up through the outstanding landscape area, it's the escarpment as it drops away from the lake frontage on the plateau and then down toward the lake edge.
Okay,
So
that's
not up into the valley. I'm not.
so that's either in the OLA or the SNA area.
Yes, it's in the
Okay.
outstanding landscape area.
Cool. And I don't understand the distinction, not being a landscape person. The landscape effects seem, on balance, more negative in your view than the natural character effects in terms of the mitigation. I'm just trying to understand what the difference is between those two things.
Yeah, it's been a little bit of a process to work through, but make the distinction between the two. Natural character effects are assessing the condition, the natural condition of an environment, and the degree of human modification is the indicator as to how the condition of that natural character. So the more modified or more human intervention into that natural environment, the lower level of natural character, and vice versa, the least amount of human modification or disruption to that landscape or area, the higher degree of natural character. And that can include weed infestation and human influences on those places. So in the coastal environment, we now have a much more rigorous approach to assessing natural character. We don't have that same requirement without the NZCPS outside of the coastal environment. So,
Okay, thank you.
but landscape considers the biophysical, the sensory, people's experiences of that, and the associative, so the human relationships that people have with landscape. Yeah.
Right. At paragraph 8 point 8, sorry, in the preceding paragraph, you talk again about the OLA and also about the resource consent process. It's similar to my question to the Regional Council. I have a degree of confusion over so much being made about the impacts on the OLA and the SNA. And my understanding that this is a resource consent process, which is actually outside the scope of the plan change process. Are you able to shed some light on that, like to help us in terms of, you know, if it's outside the scope of our work, we can't consider that.
I would perhaps defer to our planning and legal
Okay,
counsel
maybe
to help
come back
answer
to that. Yeah.
I can speak to my experience in working in plan changes around dealing with OLAs and providing, but other than that, I couldn't speak to your scope.
Sorry, I should have prefaced that with it might be a question for Mr. Bonas, but you know, it is a confusion that I have is how do we reconcile the plan change process and the resource consent process, and you know what right we have as a committee to speak to the resource consent process. So we'll save that. Okay, thank you.
Kia ora. I'm going to repeat a question that was asked earlier. Have you been on site?
Yes.
Have you been through the bush?
We went to the edge of the bush, we didn't climb down through the bush.
So,
And through to the bottom and the top.
okay.
Yes.
So have you been? So you haven't been able to go into the bush to assess the natural character inside the bush, and I'm specifically talking about the effects of pests, pigs, possums.
No, I looked to the ecological assessment to provide some advice on the condition of the biotic condition. So the natural character would look, and biophysical values would look to that. And
Okay.
I understand Ms. Monsango's relied on that.
Yeah, thank you. So you talk a lot about the adverse effects if the road was to go through, and I've heard everything we've discussed so far. What about, as a landscape architect, you are looking to the future to see what a development may look like in a year, 5 years, 10 years? what are the potential positive effects that may arise from a road going through that section?
Largely, I would I would call them more balancing effects, because the road in itself disrupts the biophysical land formation and will make modification to the biotic nature of that. So the biophysical attributes of that outstanding landscape will be modified. The sensory components of that too, which include naturalness, so people's appreciation of being wild and scenic and remote, will be modified. So the balancing is what the mitigation measures would provide, so they can be considered positive. However, I want to be clear, I'm not saying that the road's not an unacceptable proposal. I'm just saying that the degree of disturbance is yet unclear to say whether those effects would be low, and I don't think there's enough information to make for the road at this point a confident statement to say the effects would be low. And I appreciate that there is a proposal to take that to resource consent level to further assess that. So overall, I think there could be a low adverse effect, depending on how that road is designed and how it responds to the values of the feature.
Thank you.
In terms of the area on the upper plateau to which the proposed plan change 36 actually relates, in terms of that area up there, and taking into account the mitigation proposals advanced by the applicant, do you have any residual landscape or visual amenity concerns regarding that upper area?
No, and I think I clarify that in the summary statement too, but the joint witness as well. I'm comfortable that we've reached a point of providing a way of integrating the residential and responding to its sensitivities.
Yeah, excellent, thank you. A couple of questions I put to Ms. Monzongo yesterday. From a landscape perspective, would it be reasonable to view the extension across the river, the Whareroa North proposal, as a continuation of the existing village?
It much like a pocketed series of villages, you would, if you stood back, like landscape is, it's a scale-based and context-based. It sits within the catchment of the Whareroa beach, so it would be read at a broader scale as part of that settlement, but read as two effectively suburbs.
And I also put a question to her yesterday that based on our site visit, it appeared to me that the proposal to extend across the river up into the plateau, the end result would be very similar from a landscape and visual context to existing Southern Lake settlements such as Kuratau and Amori, where you have urban development, an area of retained vegetation, and then another urban development, etc. And so the pattern would be very similar to the existing pattern of development down that end of the lake. Do you have a view on that?
I think that's a reasonable statement, in that you create smaller pockets and use vegetation, well, not use, but work with the natural landscape to provide delineation of those smaller pockets.
Okay. And your evidence and your presentation today discusses the access road in some detail. And you've already said you're aware that a separate resource consent process is required for that. It's actually a discretionary activity resource consent process. There's a bundle of consents required of different classifications, but under the bundling principle, it would be assessed as a discretionary activity, so the decision maker has scope to impose whatever conditions they feel appropriate. Any residual or any concerns you have regarding the access road, are they able to be addressed through a subsequent discretionary activity resource consent process?
Potentially, yes. I I guess it's the planning mechanisms, I mean, how you're considering these today, but my only concern was that the assessments that we had in front of us were indicating a level of effect without really understanding the scale of potential of what that effect could be, of the modification could be. And so, yes, a resource consent and a separate landscape and visual effects assessment and design would provide far more certainty to that.
Because as with any discretionary activity, resource consent process and application would be required, and assessment of effects would be required.
That's correct, yes.
And I imagine landscape effects would be one of those. So,
That'd be
so when you
a big issue.
when you said potentially yes, your concerns could be addressed through that process. Is that still a potentially yes or a definitely yes?
Oh, certainly they can be addressed through that process, yes.
And just in terms of that, I'm curious as to know why you and other witnesses, particularly in your initial evidence, focused so much on the access road, given that proposed Plan Change 6 does not seek to rezone that part of the landscape. Why did you focus so much on the access road? Were you asked to, or did you form your own opinion on that?
Well, first, I probably step back a little on it, in the sense that even if the access road wasn't there, the consideration of effects on the OLA would still be required, and we did ask for that because it wasn't originally considered. So in my first peer review, I asked for the considerations on the OLA in terms of adjacent effects, and the expectations of housing on the earlier plans indicated views across the OLA, however, that the expectation may not be able to be met with vegetation screening those views. So I had concerns around potential vegetation clearance and modification to the OLA as a result of just the residential.
Sure.
And also the consideration of what would the adjacent effects be if a road clearance came through and opened up more visual exposure of the residential housing at the gap, at the cut point. So I did. It was it's not a clear cut in terms of the road remaining outside of the, not the road, but the OLA remaining outside of consideration of the effects on the OLA for the residential. So we did, and Ms. Monsengo did go through that process and respond to those questions. As a result of that, we were then supplied with visual simulations that showed the road, and hence that became a focus of some of the discussion around needing to consider what is the impact of that road coupled with the residential activity. And I think that's, obviously I wanted to look at if the information was being presented in front of me to then address those effects issues.
Okay.
Or consideration of measures to manage those effects.
It's a long answer. So,
yes,
in a nutshell, was your focus on the road resulting from information that the applicant supplied, or were you instructed to look at that by the district council?
I raised when we were there, that was raised around the road access, and then that information was then provided to me and to council. So you obviously then responded to that. I don't recall a direct instruction around the road being considered in scope.
Okay.
We had discussions around how they would access that land. Yes.
Okay. All right, thanks very much for that. No further
Okay.
questions.
All right, thank you.
So good morning and welcome, Mr. Shaw. Just while the material's been handing around, I think Ms. Ryder set an excellent example of how to present the material, so no need to reread things that summarise straight out of the earlier evidence or the joint witness statements, but the way she went to her sort of a summation of the end of that process was quite helpful. So I'm not sure how everyone else has prepared their material, but the way she did it was great. So if you're happy to follow that same example, that would be good. But if you haven't constructed yours that way, then you just lead us through it as you see fit.
Thank you. Kia ora tātou. I would like to start at paragraph 6, because all the preceding paragraphs is just simply summaries of documents that I've been involved in or have reviewed through the course of the process. So starting at 6, which is relating to comments on Mr. Wedding's rebuttal evidence, Mr. Wedding refers to our joint witness statement in which we agreed on many matters, and I have listed them there. So I don't intend to read them, but I will paraphrase them. Just that the site, that the indigenous vegetation and habitats to be affected are ecologically significant, that clearance of them does need to be kept to a minimum, the effects do need to be addressed in a mitigation/offset package, including fragmentation and edge effects, that implementation of that package can be addressed in an ecological management plan, that so minimum requirements to be addressed in that plan need to be agreed and to provide some certainty going forward to achieve no net loss and preferably a clear net environmental gain, and that the District Council should have a role to approve and certify that mitigation offset package, including obviously a right to decline or halt the project if measures are not adequate. It was not agreed how these matters could be addressed within the current plan change process. At 7, Mr. Wedding's rebuttal evidence addresses what he refers to as outstanding relevant matters, and in response to my request for more certainty in terms of the ecological mitigation and offsetting, he provided more information on the 22 hectares of land potentially available on Whareroa station for ecological restoration works. Mr. Wedding has provided a useful overview of how much of this land is bare ground and potentially available for indigenous revegetation, the areas dominated by exotic trees and the areas that appear to be fenced. Also in his rebuttal evidence, Mr. Wedding acknowledges the following, that the Whareroa stream riparian habitat is more developed forest of higher ecological value, the clearance of which will require more mitigation and a larger biodiversity offset, and that edge effects require mitigation and offsetting. Perhaps if I could just pause there, just to explain that the original ecological assessment for this site split the site into 2 units, the plateau area and the what they've referred to as the stream riparian habitat, which is all of the scarp area leading up from the stream to the plateau. Going back to my summary at 9, Mr. Wedding places heavy reliance on the provisions in Appendix 8 of Ms. Lewis's rebuttal evidence, specifically the version dated 5th of June. I have some comments on that. At 10, Ms. Lewis has usefully provided a tracked version showing the changes made to Appendix 8 with relevant provisions set out in Appendix 1, which is attached here. And I'd like to provide the following comments on these provisions. Mr. Wedding identifies 22 hectares of land and sites elsewhere on Whareroa station that are potentially available for ecological mitigation and offsetting. This area, which is a fundamentally important part of the overall proposal, is not referred to in Appendix 8. Ecological offsetting and compensation and net environmental gain are referred to in Appendix 8, but it does not explicitly state how calculations will be made to address ecological loss and to achieve a quantifiable net environmental ecological gain. For example, whether multipliers will be applied to determine the area of indigenous planting to be undertaken, the types and area of pest control to be undertaken, and the term of that work, and the types and scale of pest plant control to be undertaken. Schedule 1 of Appendix 8 is a Whareroa North Indigenous planting proposal which identifies 6 sites where planting of eco-sourced Indigenous species is to occur. This is a positive approach, and a similar type of approach could be applied to the offset areas identified in the rebuttal evidence of Mr. Wedding, but no detail has been provided on what will be restored, how this will be done, and how the sites will be managed in the longer term. And it's these matters that have been addressed in the proposed ecological management plan. Other comments? I note that in his response to a question from the Commissioners, Mr. Wedding presents an area of 1.02 hectares for the final footprint of the access road, but acknowledges that he does not know what the area of the construction footprint will be. This is a matter of concern because the road will potentially be cutting through steep and potentially unstable beds of taupo pumice. This could result in the loss of sediment into the stream and the lake, and a much larger area of Indigenous vegetation could be lost. Given the acknowledged higher value of this area, this will require greater mitigation and offsetting. In conclusion, Mr. Wedding's rebuttal evidence does demonstrate that it is potentially feasible to mitigate, offset the adverse ecological effects to be generated by the proposal, but does not provide detailed information on how this will be achieved. While many of the ecological issues can be addressed, there is still considerable uncertainty about exact footprint effects, calculation of requirements for ecological mitigation and/or compensation, and inclusion of other areas on Whareroa Station in the overall package of works. If the proposed plan change is approved, all of these matters will need to be addressed in a way that provides certainty going forward. Clearance and permanent loss and fragmentation of Indigenous vegetation and edge effects are recognised and agreed as significant adverse effects of the proposed development, but there is still a lack of certainty, and it is not clear that the ecological restoration sites, that is the 22 hectares on Whareroa Station, are within the scope of the project and how they will be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So just before I hand over for questions, so in terms of your attachment, the font, the red font, just to clarify in my mind, is that Ms Lewis's changes, or are they further changes you're recommending?
No, they're Ms Lewis's
Okay,
changes, so I haven't made any changes to that.
Great. So Poto, would start with you. Any questions for Mr Shaw? Stephen? Oh, sorry, Stephen, any questions?
My question is probably more for Mr. Broners in terms of the suggestions made here in your evidence, Mr. Shaw, or your summary, how that could be incorporated within the plan change. Thank you.
Thanks. Just one question. You mentioned you've got a list of concerns which you still have at the in your 15 to 18, but you mentioned the ecological management plan, and would it be your expectation that these will be matters which would need to be addressed through that ecological management plan?
Yes, they are.
So there's a mechanism to do it?
Yes, and preceding the preparation of that plan, there'd need to be some quite careful calculation of first of all, the exact footprint effects, the direct effects, then the indirect effects around issues like edge effects, and then a calculation of how to address those effects so there is no net, so there's no loss overall, and that there is a net environmental gain preferably from this.
Right. Thank you very much.
Good morning, Mr. Shaw. Just a couple of really quick questions from me. The first one is if that 22 hectares that's in Whareroa Station was included in more detail in the ecological plan, would that give you more confidence or certainty about the approach going forward?
Yes, it would. And the information that Mr. Wedding provided in his rebuttal evidence was very helpful in that regard. We just need some certainty that those areas are within the scope of the project.
And in your professional experience, you mentioned, sorry, that the stream and lake bed area requires a higher level of mitigation to offset. Do you believe then this, from what you know and have seen, that that could be achieved if it was identified what that needed to be? Is
Yes,
it achievable?
Yes, it is achievable. And specifically that area from the stream up to the scarp has better developed forest vegetation on it. It's older. It's probably got different site conditions as well, so there's potentially more moisture there. And so in the mitigation, that needs to be recognised in the mitigation package, so a larger area needs to be provided for planting, for example, to accommodate the loss that will occur on that scarp.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying. No further questions?
Thank you, Mr. Shaw. So it's probably abundantly clear to you and everyone else who's participating in the hearing that I'm differentiating in my mind between the upper plateau and the access road, the upper plateau being the subject of the plan change, the access road being the subject of a future discretionary activity resource consenting process. So I just want to clarify some elements from your summary statement. So on page 4 of the summary statement, the second bullet point, so when you wrote that, did you have in your mind the upper plateau or the access road?
I actually haven't had in mind both, because when I first came into the process in 2007, there were those two areas were reported on separately, but the area was being treated effectively as one unit. Late last year, during last year, when I was asked for an update on what sort of information was required going forward, because the last ecological reports had been written more than a decade ago on the site, I asked for an update on the state of the vegetation that was to be affected, which only referred to the plateau area. But the application and all the information I've been provided with through the process has consistently shown the access road.
Yeah.
So I have been referring to both because they need to be seen, in terms of ecological impact, they need to be seen together. And I realise the planning distinction that, of course, the plan change application is only for the upper area.
Yeah, okay. So same question to you, paragraph 16 on page 5, the 3 bullet points. Plateau, access road, or both?
I have in mind both, but it applies to both areas.
And same question for paragraph 18.
And then the same answer.
So in terms of the upper plateau area, should proposed plan change 36 be approved, then there's a subsequent resource subdivision consent process to go through. Under the proponent's approach, that would be a controlled activity, so obviously the matters of control are crucial in terms of giving the decision maker on that process scope to impose appropriate conditions on the subdivision. At the moment, and in response to questions, in part, the proponent has volunteered additional matters of control that would be available to a decision maker at that stage. And I just want to read out to you one of them, and I want you to tell me whether or not you think it's adequate in terms of the concerns that you've addressed. And so matter of control A would read, measures to avoid, remedy, mitigate or offset potential effects on Indigenous biodiversity. Would that give a decision maker scope to turn his or her mind to all of the issues that you've been turning your mind to?
Yes, I think it would.
Okay. All right, so thank you, Mr. Shaw, very much for coming in this morning, and no further questions.
Manette, I've got 2 questions.
Yep.
One is the same one, is whether Mr. Shaw has been on the site, and if so, how recently. And the other one relates to the appendix that he's got to his summary, which doesn't appear to be the same version as Ms. Lewis has got, was appended to her rebuttal. So I just wanted to highlight that there is a difference here and there.
Okay. So the second's just a point highlighting there appears to be not the latest material referred to. Okay. So what is your concern in that regard?
Just that Mr. Shaw seems to be referring to it as the 5th of July appendix, but it's not the same 5th of July appendix that was, June. Gosh, we're not in July yet. 5th of June appendix that Ms. Lewis has got. So just so the panel's aware that there's a discrepancy there.
Yeah, I know, but in terms of raising that concern, are you concerned that there are further changes that Ms. Lewis has proposed to us that might have a material effect on Mr. Shaw's advice to us?
Oh, I guess my concern is that if someone was to grab that summary document and use that appendix as being the latest version, it's not.
Okay, fine.
Or not the correct version.
Yeah. All right, so Mr. Shaw, in terms of site visits, what have you undertaken in terms of visiting the site?
I visited the site in 2007.
Yeah.
Walked right across it, up through the scarp, across the top, the plateau. I haven't been back to the site since. I have, which is one of the reasons why I asked the applicant or the proponent to provide an update last year on the state of the site, which only referred to the upper area and which I evaluated very closely and talked with Mr. Wedding about as well. So I didn't feel that I particularly needed to go back to the site. I also have looked at it very closely using remote imaging.
Yeah.
Combined that with my site visit. So.
Yep. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Mr. Shaw.
Okay, thank you.
Sir, if we can just call Miss Phillips, it'll just take us a little while to set the Zoom up for that.
Sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
For Miss Phillips, the geotechnical witness who's joining us from Queenstown, we'll just set that up through speakerphone.
Yep. So just Mr. Bonus, just while they're doing that, did she have a written summary thingy that could be handed out? Yeah.
Welcome to Reservation List Price Conferencing. Enter your conference code followed by dot. Thank you. If you're the leader, press star now. Please enter your leader PIN followed by the pound or hash sign. To start or join your conference, press 1. To change default conference option, press. You will now be placed into conference. After joining the call, to record the conference for those who may miss this call or for future playback, press star 2.
Sir, I can't find a copy of her statement. I know she's done one, so we'll just try and email it out to everybody, but I assume she'll take us through it. Have we got more than one?
while you're doing that, I might just check with the panel. Did anyone have any questions? We haven't heard from Ms Phillips yet in terms of her summary. Did anyone on the panel have any questions of her? Roseanne, are there any? I just have one. You do have a question? Okay.
Sir, in the intervening break, I'll distribute the summary from Miss Campion, and then perhaps during your break, if you can let us know whether or not you have any questions for her or wish to hear from her.
Sorry, you may have entered an invalid conference code or dialed an incorrect number. Thank you. If you're the leader, press star now. Reset your leader pin, followed by to start or join your conference, press 1. To check room. You will now be placed into conference. After joining the call, to record the conference for those who may miss this call or for future playback, press star 2.
Hilary, in terms of
Still hear me? Yes, we can.
so in terms of the recording and the audiovisual and people watching, do we need to swing one of these mics? So, Ms Phillips, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right, well, my name's Rob van Voorthausen. I'm the chair of the hearings panel, and so welcome aboard. We understand that you've prepared a summary statement. Unfortunately, your team here don't have copies of it to give to us. So is that correct? Have you prepared a summary statement?
Yes, I have. I can send it through to you. I think similar to the other experts, I can summarise just summarise my current position on the plan change.
Yep. So I think they do have copies of your digital copies of your statement. They just don't have paper copies to give to us at the moment. So yeah, if you can just follow the lead of Ms Ryder and Mr Shaw, and if you can summarise your position for us at this stage, that would be great. And then we'll see if we have questions for you. Thank you.
Sure, great. So, kia ora everyone, and sorry I can't see you all. Thank you for allowing me to present remotely. I'll just kick straight into the summary, which is point 6 of my statement, which you don't have, sorry. My opinion on the need for geotechnical investigation and assessment remains the same. Preliminary investigation and assessment of geohazards is required at the plan change stage, which is consistent with the guidance provided in the NZGS and MBIE Earthquake Geotechnical Engineering Practice Guidelines. No site-specific geotechnical assessment outlining the extent or likely physical impacts of the identified geohazards on future residential development has, in my opinion, been presented. It's therefore not possible for me to determine if these geohazards are likely to be tolerable or not. Whilst in theory I agree that all identified geohazards may be able to be mitigated through engineering, I don't consider that this is an appropriate pretense on which to rezone land. The EIC from both myself and Mr Fadness identify that the site is subject to significant potential geohazards. The dispute is that in the absence of suitable investigation and reporting, I'm unable to recommend to the panel categorically as to whether rezoning the site to residential is the most appropriate in terms of the Waikato Regional Policy Statement Policy 13.1 and 13.2 and the District Plan Objective 3L.2.1. I also wanted to add that I specifically have concerns about the proposed access road and the feasibility of the very high cut slopes in an area with known shallow instability issues, and although not currently known, possibly global stability issues. I understand if benching into the natural ground were not to be feasible, the proponent plans to construct retaining walls or increase the size of the excavation. Depending on ground conditions encountered, this retaining and land disturbance could be extensive and has the potential to entirely modify the eastern site boundary landform. So I guess in conclusion, just based on the material that's been provided to date, I don't support the plan change from a geotechnical perspective. That was all I had to say, and happy to take any questions that you might have.
All right, thanks very much for that. We'll see if we do have questions. We do have at least one for you, so Roseanne, we'll start with you.
Hi, Ms Phillips. My name's Roseanne Jollins. I'm one of the commissioners here today. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can, thank you.
Awesome, cool. Look, you partly answered my question actually in your summary of evidence right now. The thing that I was interested in seeking some clarification on was that if all geohazards, and as indicated in your joint witness statement, can be mitigated, that you then make the comment though that you think that it's not appropriate to consider it at the subdivision and building consent stage. And just a few minutes ago you alluded to some technical guidelines. To help me understand that, could you just clarify that a little bit further?
Yeah, sure. So I would refer to so NZGS is the New Zealand Geotechnical Society, and MBIE, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. They provide basically our best, as a geotechnical industry, they provide the best guidance that we have at the moment, and they are guidelines. They're not rules or standards as such, but they are the best that we have, and they produce, there's 6 modules currently out specific for earthquake geotechnical engineering in New Zealand, and they quite specifically outline what is expected at different stages of land development. So at the plan change stage, they outline the investigation that would be adequate.
Sure. So just to clarify that I understand correctly, then your assessment on when the geotechnical investigation should be done was based on those guidelines?
Yes, correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Ms Phillips. This is Stephen Wilson, one of the other commissioners. I want to press into or lean into the previous question actually and your response. One of the reasons that there is a paucity of questions is because, as it relates to geotech, is because of the information that we've been provided as a panel, both from yourself and Mr. Fadness. And I note, not having the guidelines in front of us, it's a little difficult, but your wording is that preliminary investigation and assessment of geohazards is required at the plan change stage. I'm not sure technically what preliminary investigations look like. As a layperson, I would have thought that we've been provided with sufficient information to know that there are potential hazards there, what those hazards are, and if memory serves, from both of your points of view, solutions that could be applied, and that the time at which detailed investigations take place would be during the consenting stage. I'm just happy if you can either, my question is whether you'd confirm my understanding, or there's more required, and what is that?
Yes, of course. So to date, the assessment that's been provided, as I understand, is based on a number of site walkovers and a desktop assessment, and also some shallow test pits that were done in 2006, I believe. So they went to a depth of 4.6 metres.
the NZGS and MBA guidelines are quite specific in that deep geotechnical investigation is required to support a plan change application. And so a deep investigation would be in the order of 20 metres for typical residential development. So currently that is lacking from, that hasn't been done to date. The other thing is that assessing those hazards is quite general, and whilst I respect that there are typical mitigation methods and worst case scenarios have been presented, they're quite general to the Taupo region. They're not specific to the site, and that's because there isn't that site-specific deep investigation. So there's not enough information to say that obviously we know there are risks, and those risks may impact the site. At the moment, there's not enough information to say, are those risks probable? What are the consequences of those risks specific to that site? And then look at that these mitigation methods will reduce those risks to a tolerable level. Which I don't think has been presented yet.
Thank you. I've got no further questions.
Thank you.
Kia ora, Ms Phillips. No questions from me either. Thank you.
So, Ms Phillips, back to me, Rob van Voorthausen. So just 3 questions for you. Is it correct that you and Mr Fadness are in agreement on the scope of investigations required, that the point of disagreement relates to the timing of those investigations?
Yes, correct.
You mentioned in your summary to us you have concerns about the access road, and you mentioned cuts and batters and retaining walls. Are you aware that the access road will require a discretionary activity resource consent for it to go ahead?
Yes, I now do understand that, listening in this morning. I'd just like to clarify that I touched on those points just because of what was raised in Mr Fadness's evidence. I recall that my initial evidence specifically didn't look at the access road at all, because I understood that it wasn't within scope. So it was really just to clarify, after seeing those 3D models and the points about benching and battering, just to clarify that, in my opinion, I don't believe there's enough information at the moment to say that those cut slopes are feasible or not.
So have you participated as an expert previously in resource consent processes for earthworks and roading cuts?
No, I haven't.
You haven't? Okay, no further questions, thank you.
Thank you.
Could we just ask the same question about whether there's been a site visit?
Maddie, are you still there?
Yes, sorry, I missed that last point though.
Yep. We have another question.
Sorry, so counsel for the applicant's been asking all of the technical witnesses whether or not they've done a site visit, and if so, when was that site visit? And so we're allowing those questions to be put. And I didn't have my microphone on. So the question is, when have you done a site visit, and if so, when did you do your site visit?
No, I haven't been to the site. I'm relying on the information of Mr Fadness.
All right, thank you very much. And so now you can hang up. You can hang up.
Great. Thank you.
So good morning and welcome, Mr. Lewis.
Good morning, sir.
So I think you understand the form, so you presented a summary statement. Happy for you to commence reading at a place in that statement that you feel is appropriate given what you've heard the other witnesses who preceded you do.
I will certainly be happy to, sir. This is about access to the plan change area. Initially, evidence was provided back in May that would be provided by way of Mary Roadway and a deed to go with that Mary Roadway. In the ordinary course of events, we would get a legal road at the time of consent. Since that, the proponent, through Mr. Mike Keys, has produced rebuttal evidence talking about an agreement in principle. There's been significant progress with the proposed development. Now there is a legal mechanism identified. There are some high-level principles that we've identified in that agreement, but the devil will be in the detail, and it also relies on processes outside of the RMA to reach agreement on those agreements. So that's with council, through council. I raised in my rebuttal evidence the issue of access has been raised with the proponent on a number of occasions over the last few years. In my mind, the agreement should have been progressed prior to the plan change application, and the approval from council, and even in principle, could have been sought prior to this hearing. I consider the initial application associated evidence in chief from the proponents placed the ability for council as asset manager to have confidence that a secure and efficient and effective access could be provided was easy to categorise as unmeetable. It simply did not address the issue of securing legal access to the plan change area. As limited only to the issue of securing access, and given the latest information to hand from the incorporations, those effects are still left to future chance. There still remains considerable uncertainty as to the efficacy now proposed. I wish to make it abundantly clear that I do not have the mandate or delegation to approve such an approach on behalf of council. However, based on the draft aspirations document, which was being referred to by Mr. Keys, I now consider that such an approach may be a viable option.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. I see we have questions for you. Poto, any questions? Stephen?
I was trying to track your reading as well as reading the actual summary. So your last sentence, am I to understand from that you now consider that such an approach may be a viable option, i.e. a tripartite agreement between Te Whareroa Māori Trust Board, the proponent and council is a viable way forward? If I've understand that correctly, does it, paragraph 5, you concluded that this matter remained unresolved. There seemed to be a slightly different position in both those two paragraphs.
So I'd just like to clarify that paragraph 5 related to the original evidence that was provided, dated on that letter dated 20th of April. Since that time, there has been further movement. Yes, I would agree that it is viable. I would still point out, though, that it still leaves it to future chance. We've still got to reach agreement on what that agreement might look like, and then I've got to go to council and seek council's approval of that agreement.
Sure. Okay, and I mean, you've heard today that matters such as a bridge access is basically outside of what we're considering for the plan change, and if memory serves, the proponent themselves have admitted that it's at their risk if the plan change is granted without access being confirmed.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good morning. Just one question. This is presumably not the first time such an issue has arisen in terms of providing for growth in the district.
It is the first time that I'm aware of this issue being arisen. In the normal course of events, as I outlined in my rebuttal evidence, normal course of events is that you get a subdivision, the roads are provided at the time of subdivision and are vested in council as legal road.
Okay. Thank you.
So just in terms of that, that last question and answer, my understanding is all of the rivers and streams that flow into Lake Taupo, the beds of those watercourses have been returned to Ngāti Tūwhori Toa as part of their treaty settlement process. Are you saying this is the first time that the district councils had to deal with a bridge over any one of those watercourses since ownership was returned to Ngāti Tūwhori Toa?
Correct.
Okay. So this is like a pilot process for the council. All right. Okay. Thanks very much, Mr. Lewis.
Good morning, Commissioners. My name is Philip Osborne. I'm the economic consultant for the 42A report. As with the other witnesses, I've prepared a summary that I will endeavour to run through relatively quickly. If we take 1 through 3 as read, starting off at paragraph 1.4. Considering the potential impacts on economic efficiency, I've considered 3 parts that I believe are pertinent. The first being the requirement for this rezoning to accommodate an expected growth in the wider district, the potential for this development to meet specific sector demand, which is the holiday homes, that is unlikely to be met elsewhere, and the potential cost to the community in light of the requirement to meet demand above, and whether these represent an efficient use of resources. My evidence looked at growth within the district itself. It used medium household growth projections from Statistics New Zealand, and it incorporated an additional 30% of demand for unoccupied dwellings to account for the holiday home market. Utilising the medium stats household growth projections resulted in a need to facilitate an additional 2,800 dwellings within the next 20 years, and under the high growth series it required a further 4,800 or 4,850 additional dwellings. Following the 2018 census, and in the absence of updated Statistics New Zealand projections, population estimates indicated that over the 5-year period, population growth had followed the high series, noting that the population series runs a further 20 years from that period. However, over this period, household growth, a primary driver for dwelling demand, exhibited growth in line with the medium growth series. Given that the household growth has empirically followed the medium Statistics New Zealand series, it was considered prudent to utilise these projections. In terms of capacity in Taupo district, I provided a breakdown in my evidence that showed that there was an indication of a total capacity of 5,600 sites, which under both the medium and high growth scenarios, and including the 30% for the proxy for holiday homes, this was more than sufficient capacity to meet the demand requirements over the next 20 years. It was therefore found that the proposed plan change did not meet an expected shortfall in residential provision. When considering more localised demand, it was not considered prudent to assess demand as a proportion of residential growth, given that the area had experienced negative population growth over the 2013 to 2019 period. Given this, historical residential consents were assessed, which indicated that the local area combined had seen a falling number of annual consents averaging 10 and more recently down to 7 per annum. This was in relation to the capacity of the same area of around about 190 units. This represented at the high end of estimated demand a minimum of 20 years capacity, notwithstanding the substitutable holiday areas in Taupo with significant capacity. Inclusion of the 47 vacant sites at Whareroa indicated their ability to form part of the future consent or dwelling demand. While potentially owned within the market, they represent, as with the others, capacity for future decisions to develop dwellings. A final consideration in relation to future demand estimates is the likely impact of COVID. While this future is an uncertain one, preliminary indications are that construction and demand will be significantly impacted. Even if the direct impacts are isolated in the short term, the impacts on overall growth and investment risk are likely to be felt for some decades. This is probably more significant in a volatile sector like the holiday homes. So in terms of people's demand to actually live in houses permanently, it's less likely to be impacted in terms of those growth, but in terms of their propensity to purchase and to demand holiday homes and holiday home locations, this is likely to be significantly impacted. This, in my view, reinforces the use of the medium household growth projections and that localised demand is unlikely to exceed the current estimates of 7 to 10 units per annum, which would necessitate additional supply by 2040 in the local area. From an economic viewpoint, there are several potential issues relating to the unnecessary provision of residential land, notwithstanding the potential impacts of council objectives, such as the consolidation of activity that relate to efficient resource use. There are potentially direct costs borne by the community that do not result in reciprocal benefits. My evidence in chief primarily dealt with the provision of infrastructure and costs that would ultimately fall on the community. While there are standard annualised maintenance costs associated with the development, there are also costs relating to the replacement of infrastructure. While it has been suggested that these costs will be ultimately incurred sometime in the future and therefore represent a cost that should not be considered, the decision to accept the proposed plan change now carries with it a commitment by the community to incur these costs in perpetuity. As such, the Council would have an obligation to plan for these costs. It has been assessed that an estimated infrastructure replacement cost at 1.5 million over 30 years would represent a net present value, including maintenance, of $660,000 when annualised to the community. It is prudent for Taupo District Council to assess its obligation to this cost when considering its efficient utilisation of resources. Given the evidence I have reviewed, it is my economic position that the proposed plan change represents an unnecessary and economically inefficient addition to residential capacity within the district. It is my opinion that the proposal is likely to result in additional costs to the community that are not offset by reciprocal public benefits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Osborne. I'll see if we have questions for you, and Commissioner Fairgrave, will start with you since you're likely to have the most questions in this case.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, and good morning, Mr. Osborne.
Good morning.
And I think just clearly running through a few things. It's common ground that demand will be primarily for holiday properties, and holiday properties, and I use the term properties as opposed to dwellings. The purchase of a property for holiday purposes may be the purchase of the land and the dwelling in one go, or as we heard from the submitter this morning, I think he purchased a site 4 or 5 years ago and is now developing it, putting a house on it. So
Yep.
it's a common process for that to occur, isn't it?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. So when you look at properties in these lakeside settlements which haven't yet been built on, but have been purchased by somebody intending to use it as a holiday property, that demand has already been expressed on the ground, isn't it?
Well, demand in itself, as you know, is a willingness and ability for for that particular product. And in a lot of cases, when people buy sections for holiday homes, they don't necessarily have that ability to build that house at that point in time. So in terms of the expression of the demand to actually use that as a holiday home, it may represent a future demand to do that. But they have expressed that demand for the dwelling as well in terms of buying the section, yes.
Yes, so that demand does not depend on the construction of the dwelling to be expressed on the ground. It relates to the time at which the property itself is purchased.
That's correct.
But and in your analysis, you've focused on the construction of dwellings as distinct from the purchase of properties.
Yeah, I believe there's there's ultimately, as we've heard this morning, a lag between the demand for a site and potentially the construction of that dwelling. We're talking about a 20-year period, and in terms of the consents that we've assessed, we've assessed those for at least a 20-year period as well. So I believe that even though sections have been bought in the past, the consents that I've assessed over the last 20 years of between 10 and 7 have been based on potentially people buying those significantly earlier in that period as well. So I believe that there's a relationship between those consents and the purchase of those sites.
Yes, okay, thank you for that. But you've identified 198 sites which are currently vacant, and this is the area we're talking about and you're talking about is the settlements on the southwestern end of Lake Taupo. So that's Whareroa, Kuratau, Aomori and Pukawa. And that's the area where you consider that demand, which could go to Whareroa, would instead easily be met in the existing remaining undeveloped sites in Whareroa and or in the undeveloped sites in those other settlements.
In terms of the geography, that would be my position. I'm not an expert on people's decisions of where to purchase holiday homes, but I believe that there is a capacity in that area to meet that. Whether, as we heard this morning, it meets everybody's needs is something separate. There are obviously different values for each one of those areas, whether it's access to amenity or whether it's isolation. There are different things that drive that demand.
Okay, but given that you're looking pretty much at that area and that location, and your view is that the absence of a dwelling yet on a site is the appropriate indicator of availability of sites to meet future demand.
I believe that. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, and that's on the basis that a site which has been purchased but remains empty does not represent already demand for future dwellings on the ground.
I think it's. I can see the position, but I think in terms of being able to understand what that future demand looks like, consents are the easiest way to look at that. It doesn't take into account the lag between purchasing the empty site and actually building the property, but it does give you an indication of the size of that market at any given point in time.
Okay, thank you. And when you undertook conferencing with Mr. Council, in his evidence he's identified that I think all of the existing sites in Whareroa have been sold off to individual or private purchasers, and you didn't have any grounds for disagreeing with that, did you, in your conferencing?
No.
Okay, and would you expect the same situation to be to apply to the other villages or settlements along the coast in Kuratau and Aomori and so on?
I would believe that there is, for holiday homes, a greater propensity for a lag between purchasing the site and building the dwelling, yes.
Right. So, but you rely on your estimate of 198 properties to for your view that demand which could go to Whareroa could equally be met on those existing 198 properties.
That's correct. I mean, it's not my position that all 198 are actually owned individually at this point. I don't actually have a position on that. I'm not sure about the ownership structure, but I understand that some of that is not actually developed yet.
Okay, thank you. Now, Also, a couple of questions about your projections of demand for holiday dwellings. Now, at the moment, or on the reading your evidence, and I think confirmed here, you've based that on a fairly simple approach. You've looked at resident population, and then you've factored that up by another 30%, based on the fact, or another more than 30%, but based on the fact that currently 30% of properties are estimated in Taupo district as a whole are estimated to be owned by people who do not reside in the district, and on that basis they're defined as holiday dwellings. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you're assuming that that relationship will persist into the future?
Well, I think that needs a little bit of clarification in terms of that current percentage. That's a percentage that has persisted for some time beyond just where it currently exists. For the last, in terms of the data that's available over the last 2 censuses, that's been a fairly consistent proportion of the market, has been around 30%. It's an indicative trend. More than anything else, as I'm sure you're aware, probably more than most, there's a lot of factors that go into holiday home demand, and most of that is external to the Taupo market. Most of that relates to, I mean, there are some internal things like capital gain and so forth within the market, but in terms of the ability for growth in Auckland and other areas, and the general economic environment that people purchase holidays or are able to purchase holiday homes in, that plays a very large role. And why the potential long-term impacts of COVID are actually quite important. There is quite a more pronounced business cycle to holiday home demand than there is residential demand. There's a lot more factors that go into whether people are going to own a holiday home or whether they're actually going to own it as an investment property in terms of being able to rent it out to Airbnb and things like that. So the number of visitors that come to Taupo generally is an indicator as well. Now, we looked at that sort of thing as an indicator for holiday home demand, and it followed the same sort of lines. The historical trend of visitor numbers within Taupo was in keeping with that percentage. We looked to see if there was a large increase in any given time for visitors, whether there was a commensurate increase in the proportion within the market that was holiday homes, and that wasn't. Given that there's a significant amount of time in between each census, it was difficult to isolate individual areas, but there wasn't really any dramatic increase in that proportion.
Okay, so I gather from that you've done things like looking at the ratio of normally unoccupied dwellings to occupied dwellings at each census point.
Yes.
And compared that with over time as to how that would change.
Yes.
And you've gone back, how far have you gone back?
Just to 2006. So just
you haven't gone back to 2001 to do that?
Just the 3 census points.
Okay.
Yes.
But you do acknowledge that if most of your demand is obviously coming from outside the district, then I suppose there's 2 things. One is that the demand or the growth in population and households in Auckland and other parts of the Waikato may be a better indicator of demand for holiday dwellings in Taupo, or holiday properties in Taupo, than simply the growth in the resident population in Taupo.
I would agree that that's definitely a determining factor. I would suggest that the state of the economy probably is an even better indicator than that, even over a long-term period. The willingness for the market to actually purchase a holiday home changes more with income, disposable income and wealth than it does just with population growth.
Yes, and as you've mentioned, there'll be a number of effects from the COVID pandemic. One of those effects will be that there's a degree of economic downturn. Another effect will be that there'll be presumably a greater propensity to holiday within New Zealand and spend your money on holidaying in New Zealand, particularly amongst perhaps the elder segments of the population. So that might actually boost demand for holiday dwellings at the same time as general economic downturn is suppressing it.
I would agree. Generally, as well. There's a number of factors, obviously suppressing and potentially increasing that demand. But when we find a shock as large as we have in terms of COVID and the likely impacts, you tend to find structural changes a lot more. So you find that people are likely to invest in a holiday home as almost as a group. So because of the impact and the personal cost and the proportional personal cost of buying a holiday home, you find that people buy them as groups, or you find that people are more likely not to purchase it given the access to Airbnb, which obviously accounts for a lot more potential holiday makers in an area than individually owning a house. New Zealanders typically, there's two driving motivations. One is obviously to have a holiday home in and of itself, and the other one is as an investment. And I think we'll find that in terms of that investment return, that will be significantly suppressed in the coming decade, I would say.
Okay. And as you've summarised in your last paragraph, your view is that additional capacity at Whareroa is unnecessary because it could be satisfied in the other lake settlements and Whareroa. It's a summary of your position, isn't it?
I believe that the council has provided sufficient capacity to meet expected demand.
But your specific term, sorry, keep going.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, your specific term is unnecessary. It was throughout your evidence and is repeated here.
I believe it's unnecessary to meet that growth.
Okay.
Yes.
Right. And you've identified it is economically inefficient on the basis of additional costs for infrastructure?
Yeah, I've highlighted and expressed the impacts on infrastructure. I've quantified those impacts. There are potentially other economic impacts from other objectives of council in terms of consolidation and so forth of residential activity and land use itself that go beyond just those infrastructure costs, but I haven't explicitly measured those.
Okay, and given that here we're talking about a pattern of urban development at a district-wide level, and this development will be part of it, you would expect that there'll be a range of benefits and costs associated with different patterns of demand or different patterns of urban growth across a district. Would you accept that?
I would accept that, yes.
And in this case, you've looked at one specific cost, but not a whole range of costs, and you haven't really looked at any of the potential benefits.
I haven't looked at the nominal benefits that potentially result from this development. I believe that if, in fact, there is sufficient capacity within the existing structure, then all this potentially represents is a redistribution of that demand, and therefore the potential benefits are simply a redistribution as well.
Okay, so if you're looking at the effects and the benefits and costs of an urban development process, presumably you'd expect to look at a with Whareroa versus a without Whareroa outcome at the district level as well as specifically, and that hasn't been part of your brief, has it?
That hasn't been part of my brief, no.
Okay, so your conclusions about Whareroa being unnecessary are based simply on your view of available capacity elsewhere, and that the depreciation associated with infrastructure would impose an additional cost on the community.
That's the focus of my position.
And just finally, as I said, depreciation is usually paid out of or provided for in council accounts.
It is. I mean, I've utilised depreciation in terms of a proxy for an economic cost rather than actually using an accounting cost as an economic cost. So it's a proxy for the need for council to consider this, and having incurred this cost by making the decision, they're going to have to actually plan to meet this cost.
Okay. And normally a council would make provision for depreciation from its revenue, and presumably you would accept that if new sites are created in Whareroa and they're residential, there will be an increase in council revenue from from rates and uniform charges and so on.
Again, in terms of the potential benefits from the additional sites, my position would be that those rates are potentially, again, a redistribution from somewhere else that doesn't therefore develop, that is already planned for by the council. So if it is a redistribution of demand, then obviously that demand comes from somewhere else. And if that, in terms of a market response, means that that land is not developed, that is already zoned, then those rates don't go to council.
So, sorry, are you saying that if there's 160 sites zoned and created at Whareroa, there will be an equivalent 160 sites not zoned and not provided for elsewhere in the district? Is that what you're saying?
Potentially, that will be where it comes from, that demand.
Okay, and presumably when we talked a minute or so ago about the overall costs and benefits of two different growth outlooks for Taupo district, and you didn't look at that specifically, did you assume that those matters had been considered in the TD 2050 process and its update?
I had presumed that those were considered in the objectives and policies of the district plan itself.
Okay.
Yes.
And that would have flowed through to the recent update we're talking about on the southern structure plan and so on?
I would have thought so, yes.
Okay. Right, so the wider costs and benefits of this, the with Whareroa versus the without Whareroa growth strategy for the district would have been covered in those.
I would have assumed
in those processes.
Sorry, I would have assumed that in order to actually justify the objectives within the district plan of that consolidated activity in that urban form, that those would have been considered. Yes.
Okay. And in the most recent update, Whareroa, and I think it's covered in all of the joint witnessing statements, Whareroa is identified as an urban growth area, or an area for urban growth. So you would assume that that's been on the basis of those matters have been taken into account, in your view?
I would have thought in terms of, I would have expected so, yes, that would have been assessed in terms of its identification.
Right. Thank you very much.
Roseanne, any further questions? Go ahead, yep,
Okay.
of course.
Hi, I'm Roseanne. Just a couple of really quick questions from me just to help me understand this as we all weigh it up. The assumptions that you made in your demographic and household projections, do they align with the same assumptions that the TDC made in the 2050 refresh?
It's my understanding that they've used a medium.
So same
Yes.
source?
Yes.
Okay,
Stats
all
New
right. The next quick question was on 1.4, you ask us to consider, you outlined three main points that you consider are the economic considerations that are pertinent to this decision. In your view, are those three areas, should we give them equal weight, or do you see what's...
I don't think they can be taken in isolation.
Sure,
I
yep.
think in terms of the expected or the ability for currently zoned land to meet expected growth, that plays to the relevance of the costs. So you would expect that there would be costs, infrastructure costs and so forth for the community to meet growth. I guess if you answer the first one of those issues with this is not necessary, or this is that we don't, that this is not an efficient outcome in terms of it doesn't meet, it's not needed to meet growth or not required to meet growth, then is it a cost that is a net cost at that point? There's no accommodation of growth at the same time. You're not increasing your residential population. It's not required in that sense.
Okay.
So they all relate to each other.
They all relate to each other.
Yes.
All right. And just a couple of points of clarification for me. You talk about future infrastructure costs on the community. In your mind, what do you mean by infrastructure? What composes there?
Well, in my mind, it's quite a wide range of costs. There are some specific ones that we looked at in terms of replacement for the bridge and roading and things like that for this particular plan change. But infrastructure is a much wider concept than that, and obviously for the council costs, it's a much wider cost bracket as well. But more than just the costs of providing additional infrastructure, it's the efficiency of the existing infrastructure that you need to consider as well.
Okay, and two very last quick questions. You talk about net present value of 660K. Do you see that as something that is spread across the district or for the Whareroa village residents?
No, it's, well, the income source for that cost is a district-wide, at district level, so it's a district cost rather than just Whareroa, yes.
And are you able to tell me what is the percentage split between resident and non-resident ratepayers in this district? Do you know?
No, not off the top of my head, no.
Okay.
But I would imagine that the unoccupied dwellings give some idea of what that would be.
Okay, all right, just wondered if you knew. Thank you, that's all my questions.
Thank you.
Stephen?
Thank you. How you doing? Good. Three questions for me, and the first one was at 1.4 you refer to the NPS UDC. My understanding is that Whareroa is not an urban development.
No, in terms of the requirement for council to meet that, I'm simply talking about how this relates in the context of council's provision for future growth. So
Right.
not specifically in terms of Whareroa being in an urban area.
Okay, cool. Thank you. The second one is in relation to a previous question, the cost of the community long term of Whareroa proceeding, and one of the areas of tension is when those costs are incurred by the community, and depreciation, infrastructure. I'm not an economist or an accountant, I don't understand that fully, but I am curious as to how your view would change in terms of the modelling if we're looking out, say, 40 or 50 years, when some of this infrastructure would start needing repairs or replacement or whatever. In terms of how would your view change as to the economic viability of this project?
Put simply, no. In terms of the expected growth within the area, I would have thought that even in the longer term there is sufficient capacity to meet that. So the provision of an additional 160 units goes beyond the current and the next district plan assessment. So I would still consider those costs. I mean, at some point you may well need to incur those costs, but it's a significant way down the future. We're talking 50 years, sort of 40, 50 years potentially, before that might be required. So those costs in the meantime represent a real cost, obviously, to the community that they incur without, as I say, any necessary economic benefit.
Okay, putting aside for the moment, of course, the benefit in terms of rates, revenue and so on from that development, were it to go ahead. The last one, it may not be for you, but, and it might be Becca. We're going to be getting to you shortly, sir. But in terms of the statements such as unnecessary and economically inefficient, and then this is an unnecessary provision of residential land, it's surprising in the context that Whareroa North has been floated and has survived whatever process was followed for TDC 2050 and the Southern Structure Plan. My understanding of processes like that is that certain nodes disappear through whatever methodology and certain remain through whatever methodology. Whareroa North has survived that process, and now almost without exception, by and large, the Section 42A team is saying decline. And then I'm just curious how that fits in, how that makes sense.
First of all, I agree with you. it doesn't seem to, again, I'm dealing purely from an economic point of view. There are a number of other factors that go into consideration of growth node, social factors and all sorts of other things that are outside the quite narrow scope of the economics. But I agree that it seems the retention of this as a growth node is strange, given that the council have already provided more than sufficient capacity and provided for an efficient utilisation and provision of infrastructure to continue to allow that to be represented, and apparently the way it has been represented.
Okay, thank you. And with the passion in my tone, I don't want to get anyone to get a sense of predetermination of what's going on here. I was just curious in terms of the process that's followed and where we stand in that overall process. So thank you very much.
I just have a couple of questions. I want to boil this down to a very simplistic view of what they all just said over there. So if I have two sections and I have a house on one section, my other section's right there, and all of a sudden I get all these people coming into my house, which sometimes happens with my family, all of a sudden that's an increased demand and I'm full to capacity. The obvious thing would be to build a house on the next section. This seems to me to be what the situation is. All the sections are sold in Whareroa. They have another section of land that is capable of being developed, which will take up the excess demand. Is that reasonable? Is that a reasonable view?
To a degree it is. It depends on how, first of all, the boundaries in which you're assessing that. If you look wider, there are sites for the future that are able to be developed and absorb that demand that you've just talked about in terms of the site demand. But yeah, for the most part, there is that capacity that exists there for the type of demand that you're talking about. The additional demand where sites have been sold and people are waiting to build or waiting to enter that aspect of the market. But there is still available a significant level of capacity within that local area if we assume that that is substitutable.
Thank you.
Yes.
The other thing you talked about is the costs to the ongoing cost to the community through the subdivision. Well, the community already bears costs of developments now that are being established around the community. So I think that's a bit of a that happens right across the district.
No, you're completely right. There is a cost, no matter what, in terms of having growth in a community. There's a cost in terms of infrastructure, there's a cost in terms of congestion of infrastructure and all those sorts of things. But on the other side of the ledger, let's say, there are the benefits of having that growth and the extra people in here or the extra holiday homes. I guess what we're talking about here will this produce growth in itself, or is this just absorbing growth that would happen and would go somewhere else anyway, that has already been provided for and the infrastructure is already in place? So if you have, for example, your two sites, one that is unzoned and unserviced and another one that is, and you continue to provide more of these, you have greater infrastructure costs per person, per dwelling. So we could rezone huge tracts of Taupo, have to provide infrastructure for that, but not get any additional growth, which means that we have an inefficient use of those resources. It's costing us more per person or more per holiday home or whatever market you want to assess it in. We're trying to get an efficient use of that infrastructure, which is the lowest cost for the most people we can accommodate.
Yes. Thank you. No further questions.
So, Mr. Osborne, as you have probably been able to determine from some of my questions, I find this case quite perplexing. And I'll just briefly summarise for your benefit and others why that is the case. Consistent with the Waikato Regional Policy Statement, this District Council has produced a strategic growth document called TD 2050. It identified Whareroa North as a growth node. As recently as 2018, it refreshed that document and it retained Whareroa North as a growth node. Back in 2013, consistent with the direction in the regional policy statement, it prepared a southern settlement structure plan which showed this area as being a future residential growth area. The Taupo district plan itself, and it's part of the plan called the Southeastern and Western Urban Growth Areas, shows Whareroa North as an urban growth area. The council at a strategic level has consistently determined this area to be appropriate for residential development. If it didn't want it to be developed for residential purposes, it would not have done all of that. We are obliged to take the statutory instruments as we find them. It's not up to us to second guess whether or not the council should have done that. It has done that. So to me, the only issue is not should this area be rezoned, because clearly it should be, and the council has said so in its statutory documents. The only issue for me is when should it be rezoned. So in terms of your area of expertise and the analysis that you have done, what would lead you to say that this area should be rezoned? What would affect the timing of that in your mind?
We have a series of projections that we're relying on to provide an efficient distribution of population and holiday home growth around Taupo. Based on those projections, and those are ever-changing, especially in the environment in which we sit, based on those projections, there is, in this area, given the information I have at hand, I mean, we are looking at, even if we look at a lag between purchase of the site and development of the building itself, we're still looking at a period of 20 years before this may well be necessary.
And in saying that, that's on the assumption that demand for Whareroa North would not be unique?
That's
that
based...
it would not result in demand from it. That's based on the assumption that it will draw demand from other areas that are already zoned for residential development. Is that correct?
And that's the important consideration, the level of substitutability within the market. Whether this will create 160 additional households or holiday home makers that wouldn't have otherwise come to Taupo at all.
So we've received evidence from the proponent that Whareroa North is unique and that it won't draw demand necessarily from other areas that have different features. And I found it quite interesting this morning. We heard passionately from a lay submitter about the uniqueness of Whareroa North and why that lay submitter had purchased a section there recently. He talked about its isolation, its connection with nature, and he gave, in my view, compelling evidence about the unique nature of Whareroa North. So I'm not at all convinced that there is not a unique element to Whareroa North that would mean that it would necessarily draw demand from other areas. Do you have a response to that?
I think there are unique factors in any location, whether those are natural factors or whether it's access to amenities and access to shopping and all sorts of things. Yeah. There are unique, I think a lot of people could make claims that their area is in fact unique. I think there are market drivers that weigh up that uniqueness and the potential for other substitutes, and whether there is the level of demand that would suggest it's Whareroa or not Taupo at all is another question. Given the opportunity, people may locate in Whareroa, but without that they may locate in other places or other holiday destinations in Taupo.
So that's all about giving people choices, and my understanding of economics is that competition is a good thing. And so given the nature of that discussion, why would we not just let this rezoning proceed? And it's subject to a subsequent multiple resource consent process, subdivision consent, road access consent, so there's no guarantee that will be successful, but assuming that it was, why wouldn't we then not let the market demand? Why wouldn't we let the market decide if there's demand for sections at Whareroa North?
I mean, there is validity in that. The difficulty with that is that the market doesn't consider all the other costs that are involved. In pure economic sense, we've got private and public costs and benefits. And in terms of making a decision as a developer, the key consideration there is the private costs and private benefits. And so what we're talking about here, I guess, is the efficiency of things like infrastructure, the efficiency of urban design, the efficiency of accommodation of growth, and the fact that allowing the market to continue to produce what it wants in terms of private costs and benefits comes in some cases at a significant public cost. And I guess that's what the plan attempts to do. It attempts to amalgamate and internalise those costs in the consideration process.
Yeah, so two issues there in my mind that have been troubling me in terms of your response as to why we don't let the market just resolve this demand issue for us. You referred there, you said the market does not consider all other costs. So two issues there for me. I assume that's the costs you identify at the bottom of your paragraph 1.10. It's the future maintenance and replacement costs for the infrastructure.
Those are the ones that I've specifically identified and quantified, yes.
So those sorts of costs would be associated with any development. Those sort of costs would accrue no matter when this area was developed. So I'm still struggling to understand why that's a pertinent issue.
So, for example, if you have capacity in an existing network of infrastructure and you can accommodate growth within that infrastructure capacity and so forth, then the marginal cost for that is significantly less than providing that infrastructure again somewhere else. So it's about that efficiency of the resource use and efficiency of infrastructure that we're talking about, rather than just will more development require more infrastructure.
So just on that, I'm going to interrupt you there because my understanding is that the infrastructure associated with this development is already in place and has sufficient capacity. We have total agreement from the roading and traffic experts that the roading network can cope with this development. There's no adverse effect there. The wastewater treatment plant has been designed to cater for Whareroa North. The proponents have given additional land for an expanded wastewater disposal area to cater for the development. I understand that the potable water supply has been designed to cope with Whareroa North. It might need some minor upgrades, but the infrastructure by and large is already in place, and the costs of getting the water and the sewerage to the new development will be met 100% by the proponents. So I'm really struggling to find that this argument of infrastructural cost has any legs at all, to be honest.
So I would, notwithstanding the detail that you just went into, my evidence has identified that there is a replacement cost for the infrastructure that's been provided, that there is maintenance, and that all those costs don't necessarily need to be incurred by the community if growth is located in areas that already have that infrastructure. So we're duplicating some of the infrastructure and acknowledging that the front end cost of that is provided by the developer. There are community costs to the accommodation of growth in this particular area that potentially could be accommodated in other locations.
Sure, and so the issues there is that would be the case for any development. And as a decision-making panel, we need to assume that the council has acted rationally and that they have borne those factors in mind when deciding through multiple statutory processes that this area should be rezoned residential.
I think your second point is valid. The first point, in terms of every development has to incur these costs, that infrastructure is already in place in some places.
Including here.
Well, no, the bridge and so forth and other things that the council was going to have to incur and replace and maintain is not. Those are additional costs that the council.
So I just want to interrupt you there. Why do you say the bridge would need to be replaced?
Well, eventually it needs to be maintained, and there are costs involved in actually all this infrastructure has a time limit, an age, and that's detailed more by the engineers than myself. Of which point council would have to depreciate these assets and actually replace them and provide for that funding for that.
Okay. All right, thank you very much, Mr. Osborne. No further questions from me. So, Mr. Winchester, what we might do now, because we've been going for quite some time, is we'll take a short break for, say, 15 minutes, just for health and safety reasons. And in that meantime, we'll read the material that's been tabled from Ms. Campion, and then we'll let you know whether or not we have questions for her, and if we do, we can get her on the phone, and if not, we'll just take the written material that she's helpfully prepared on its merits. And then just to remind you that we'll then, because of me solely, and I apologise for this, just by way of explanation, I'm on the governance board for MFEs, or the new fast track RMA legislation, and there's a meeting of the governance board at 1 o'clock that I need to attend, so my apologies for that, but we'll be adjourning at 1 o'clock for about an hour and a quarter. So we'll adjourn now for 15 minutes, come back, let you know whether or not we have questions for Ms Campion, and then we can proceed with the rest of your case, if that's okay. Great, thank you very much.
evidence that this still will meet a stormwater. It's still part of the stormwater proposal in the effect that it requires to be vegetated. So there was an agreement between the parties that this area should be vegetated, and I understand that is to ensure that stormwater management of the area that is above the erosion scar. So, sorry, your question relates to the...
Well, I get that.
Yeah.
Now it's no longer being used for stormwater. Why does council still want it vested?
I think it still has a part to play in that stormwater management. Though it might not need infrastructure, it still needs to be vegetated.
Okay, that's at odds with what you've said in 2. I'm not trying to debate it with you, I am trying to get clarity here, where this part of the site is not required for stormwater infrastructure, so I'm uncertain.
No, it's not required for stormwater infrastructure, but it's still part of the stormwater proposal, and that it needs to be vegetated to protect the erosion scar below it.
Okay, so is your view then that the best way to do that
is to have it vested in council? Yeah. And I'm also questioned the fact that they have proposed a local purpose access reserve would dissect the Māori reservation and how that management would occur and operate. So, you know, whether there was responsive maintenance, how any parties that were came across a tree that had fallen across the access way, who do they call? Was it the people that manage the Māori reservation, or is it council? So it would just be more consistent if that whole area was managed by one body.
Okay. So to take that a bit further then, is it your view that, well, can stormwater be managed on private land, or must it be managed on reserve land that council owns?
I don't think it. I think it could be managed on private land, but I think council has the skills, and particularly if there were stormwater ponds adjacent, they would be out there managing that anyway. So it would provide more efficient maintenance if the whole area was served by one body.
Okay, thank you.
So, Pato?
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Thank you for that. That's given me a bit more understanding around the desire for council to have that land. I just want to pick up on the economic benefit, and I'm really just still thinking about the past discussion. So surely there are cost benefits for council in leaving this in ownership of the Māori landowners, because then they would, firstly there's a couple of things. There's a cultural economic benefit because the land is not divided, then they get to retain the whakapapa of that land. Then there's the cost benefit of council not having to maintain that reserve, and regardless of who's going to plant it, it is still performing a stormwater function. So, and do you have an opinion on that?
I do understand that the kaitiakitangi aspect of managing that land would be met through the Māori reservation. It is the issue around ensuring that there is some agreement around the levels of service, how that area would be maintained, how the response maintenance, and that could be achieved through some sort of agreement.
Yes.
But at this stage, that hasn't been clear.
Well, I think with the respect, there needs to be a conversation had about how that would be managed. So, thank you.
Doug, any questions? No, I don't have. And Roseanne? Just a couple of sort of procedural matters here. You're giving us evidence as an independent expert, so just looking at the second page of your evidence under the heading B, provision, ownership, etc. If you go down to Romans V, you say TDC's preference. Who in TDC told you that?
Sorry?
Can you look at your documents,
yes,
your
yes.
table today? So on the second page,
The Taupo District Council's Parks Manager has indicated that that was their preference.
and so what's that person's name?
Sorry, off the top of my head. Greg Headley.
So there's so he's what, the Parks Manager? Sorry, Hilary, you're not allowed to help the witness out. This is this witness's evidence. So you spoke to, I didn't get his name. What was the name?
Greg Henley.
Greg Headley or
Headley.
Hendley?
Headley.
Hadley, and he's the Parks Manager, and he told you
He was Mr. Mori's
Yep.
manager.
And so Mr. Halliday told you that the District Council's preference was that the entire area be vested in the council.
Yes.
Okay. And then going to your conclusion, again, because this is your evidence to us, and you don't speak for the District Council, or you shouldn't, in paragraph B, in the fourth line, where it says, while TDC are not necessarily opposed, should we cross that out and say, while I am not necessarily opposed, so that this actually becomes your evidence?
I am not opposed to the idea of it being a Māori reservation.
So should we cross out while TDC are not necessarily opposed and say, and should that say, while I am not necessarily opposed, so this becomes your evidence?
Sure.
Okay. Okay. And you said in answer to one of the other questions that you thought in terms of management of the reserve, it would be preferable to have it all in one entity. And you gave a good example of a tree falling across the pathway, and I can understand that. So would it be suitable then if the pathways were retained as Māori reservation?
The proponents have talked about this being local purpose access reserve, and there probably is a way in which the design could be achieved by having the access running relatively close to the road reserve, so having a wide local purpose access reserve that was managed by the council with the other stormwater and access ways, and then having the Māori reservation not dissected by the local purpose or access way.
Oh, sorry, I'm only talking about the area that's relevant to the plan change. So I'm talking about this little orange pathway that goes through the area of proposed Māori reserve. You probably can't see this because you're a long way away. So would it be suitable to have that pathway, which I understand from the legend is intended to be local purpose reserve, would it be suitable to have the orange pathway as Māori reserve in your view?
It could be achieved that, but by then, as a Māori reservation, they would then be responsible for that maintenance.
Yeah.
And I think it would be more consistent if the access ways were all maintained by the council.
Okay.
And what I was proposing is that it not necessarily dissect the Māori reservation, but it could be moved slightly northward so that there wasn't a separation between the two.
Okay, so you move the orange little pathway so it sits next to the proposed Māori reserve rather than going through it.
So it sat between the Māori reservation and the road reserve. It would have to be of a certain width to accommodate some sort of...
Sorry, you're losing me again because there is no road reserve there, it's just...
Oh, sorry, just on the yes. So it would not be separated, dissected through the Māori reservation.
Right. So it would just follow the boundary of it?
Yes.
Okay.
So then it would follow, as you can see on the western side between the two stormwater ponds, there is what is to be a local purpose access reserve. So you would run that through, and then it would continue down where the off-road link is also provided.
Okay, thank you for that. So Dr. Farrar, in terms of the proponents' reply in this issue, this matter, two issues for me, would the proponents be happy to make the pathway within the area to be rezoned Māori reserve, and that means that, and I don't want you to answer now, I want you to take instructions and then put this in your reply. So would the proponents be happy to have the pathway within the rezoned area as Māori reserve, and that means that they're then responsible for clearing off any trees that fall over it, etc. and also what then would be their view to the suggestion we just heard that possibly move that pathway so it sits on the boundary of the proposed Māori reserve but could then stay as local purpose reserve, in which case the district council would be responsible for removing any trees that fell across the pathway. So if you could just take instructions and address that in reply, that would be great. Thank you. So any further questions from Ms. Campion from the panel? No, thank you very much for coming in.
I'm in your hands, sir. I expect Mr. Bonas will get through a summary by then. Maybe it will give you some food for thought.
Okay. So maybe if we have Mr. Bonas read his summary out to us, and then we can mull it over an extended lunchtime and come back then with questions and hear from anything that you want to tell us at that stage too. Would that be right?
Yes, indeed. Yes, yeah. I think that would work.
Okay, good. So Mr. Bonas, obviously you've tabled some material. We haven't had a chance to read it through fully, so if you're happy just to revert back to the old way of doing things and read it out to us word for word, and if you're going to interpolate, can you please say, I'm now going to interpolate, and then we can take a note of anything extra that you add.
No, we'll do, sir.
Thank you.
Panel. Look, it's not lengthy, but there's been quite a bit of material that was provided through rebuttal evidence for the proponents that quite rightly needs to be considered carefully by the council and responded to. The purpose of this summary is to try and balance up all of those things and provide a summary of the council's view. So I'll take my time through it. There's also a few questions.
Sorry, so just pause you there. When you say the council's view, you mean your view as an independent planner advising
My
us
view
there?
in terms of bringing all the other experts' independent views together,
Yes.
in terms of the colonial vineyard tests.
Yeah, words are important.
Is tucked in here. No, agreed. So just in terms of paragraph 4, substantial additional material has been provided by the proponents through rebuttal evidence. That material is principally focused on establishing the viability of mitigation of environmental effects from the plan change associated with Indigenous biodiversity and landscape, and seeking to ensure that there is a known basis for a possible tripartite agreement on establishing public and service access via the concept of a Māori roadway. Greater focus has been applied to the Whareroa North Outline Development Plan, Appendix 8, ODP. There is criticism in the legal submissions of Dr. Forrett that representatives of the council have not communicated or acted in good faith. Attachment L of my evidence in chief sets out a chronology dating back to July 2007 of all the endeavours undertaken by council to communicate and address matters. I agree completely with Dr. Forrett that the package of measures now included in Appendix 8 is better than the application is notified. And I otherwise cannot accept from the face of the record that the criticism of the council's conduct is unwarranted. Mr. Winchester may wish to address the suggestion. Now, the subject side is complex. I don't think that comes as a surprise to anyone, which is reflected to the extent by which the site and the approach is subject to express consideration of a number of Section 6 RMA matters. The evidence in chief and rebuttal evidence outlined 5 key impediments which underpinned the council's recommendations to decline the plan change. The Section 42A recommendation to decline the plan change. These matters are independent. I won't take you through all of those, but essentially A is in relation to Indigenous biodiversity, B is in relation to landscape and natural character, C is the absence of an agreed legal mechanism to provide satisfactory public access and convey services across Whareroa River in perpetuity. D was agreement as to the range of geotechnical investigations to be undertaken and the timing of those. And E was based on the evidence of Mr. Osborne, the supply-demand economic efficiency issues which we heard before. Now, the approach in the evidence in chief and rebuttal in the Section 42A report was in light of those factors, the plan change status request could not be demonstrably be regarded as more appropriate than the status quo in terms of meeting the relevant statutory tests, and the colonial vineyard tests that I've outlined in Section 4 of my report. So in terms of where we've moved to, landscape, Indigenous biodiversity and the Māori Road, are they viable? Now there was a question from Commissioner Wilson in terms of well look, we've just got to look at the zoned area, which is the residential component at the top of the plateau. how involved can we be in terms of looking at the road and the bridge access, and what matters and weight in terms of considerations can we give to that. My view on that is actually quite clear. There are a number of provisions in the framework, and therefore that both myself as planning officer and the panel must turn its mind to in terms of effective coordination of infrastructure. Actually, the ability to get infrastructure up to a site that could be rezoned as residential. It has to turn its mind as to whether or not those matters and those mechanisms are actually viable in terms of facilitating a zoning that they're looking at. It simply comes down to the appropriateness of that zoning, and is it efficient and effective in terms of the zone and the rules that go with it to provide for such, as being the more appropriate than leaving it as a rural environment. Yes, fully accept, and I think it's pretty clear within our evidence.
Sorry, you're just doing a massive interpolation now. So I asked you to tell us when you were doing that. So I don't want to interrupt your flow, but when you've finished interpolating, can you just tell us which paragraph you're going back to?
Certainly. And I think I'll probably wrap the interpolation up there. It pretty much speaks to the issue of why those matters have been considered by council officers. So in terms of paragraph 10, my approach to considering matters associated with landscape, indigenous biodiversity and infrastructure connections involve considering whether the mechanisms proposed, including those subject to separate consent or agreement, are viable. I agree with the panel chair that the provision of the road and bridge is subject to separate consent mechanisms, but the efficacy of the plan change is dependent on those matters. I am considering viability in its broader sense, and that whether a favourable outcome is possible, not whether it is feasible or whether it will succeed. And I think that's a critical component in terms of, I'm interpolating again, the information and the Section 42 officers' approach, specifically in terms of landscape and indigenous biodiversity, so that they can have a clear understanding, not to the level of detailed design and will consent be granted, but is there actually a mechanism there that makes the zoning viable? And it's the same for the road. The joint witness statement of experts have got to the point where there is agreement that adverse effects on landscape and indigenous biodiversity would be material without appropriate management. I understand that the experts are at a point where they are largely in agreement as to the package of mitigation which would be necessary, as contained in the latest revision of Appendix 8. Whilst there remain concerns that the package could benefit from further polishing, I'm of the view that these aspects of the plan change are viable and would give effect to the respective provisions of the regional policy statement and achieve the provisions of the district plan. The risks are now, in my view, appropriately assessed by the work undertaken to date and would inform the final methodologies adopted during a resource consent process. Subject to questions of scope, they are therefore not an impediment to the panel in granting approval to the plan change. I also consider the same applies in terms of the Murray roadway. Mr. Lewis is carefully advised as to his role in the aspirations agreement, and that he agrees in principle to the proposed components identified therein. The caution remains that the agreement to the Murray roadway involves an exercise of discretion by the council under the LGA and the Murray Land Court. In terms of Appendix 8 and triggers, the following triggers to enable residential development are Murray roadway, deed of agreement and joint application to Murray Land Court. Preliminary stage, geotechnical investigations to determine hazard risk. Stage 1, resource consent to clear indigenous vegetation, subdivision and earthworks to enable road and bridge in SNA 62 and OLA 60. Only the triggers are satisfied. Only once the triggers are satisfied can development be enabled by the zoning, and then that is able to proceed. Whilst these matters are still subject to future chance, there is considerable more clarity in the aspirations document for the former and Appendix 8 for the latter. In terms of demand and efficient use of infrastructure, these matters remain unresolved. I am not of the view that these matters can be left to the market, given the respective Waikato Regional Policy Statement and District Plan framework relating to integrating urban form and growth with infrastructure. And I'll interpolate again. Sir, you raised a point, and a pertinent point in terms of the weight to be provided to the SSSP and also TD 2050. The refresh is in 2018 is not just the blobs. It's the written material that goes with that as well. The growth strategy is the document as a whole. And in my evidence in chief, and I'm happy to read it out again, is section 4.7, which refers to Whareroa North. It identifies Whareroa North as included as a future growth area on the basis that it has previously been identified in planning documents, and Council has recently received a private plan change seeking to have the zoning changed. It will need to be demonstrated that there is a demand for this land and the cost to the community can be appropriately managed. Ultimately, its future will be determined through the private plan change process. So, sir, I certainly take your point, and it's clear in my evidence in chief that I think substantial weight can be provided to the document, but the document is not silent that these matters can't be considered. Where did I get to? Paragraph 17. I am not of the view that these matters can be left to the market, given the respective regional policy statement district plan framework relating to integrating urban form and growth with infrastructure. Both of these documents do not recognise nor provide for a pure market approach to new urban growth management, and indeed take a very careful and considered approach, which is centrally important when considering relevant statutory tests under the RMA as to whether the request should be approved or declined. At a district level, Mr Osborne identifies that based on medium NZ Stats household forecasts and the extent of land supply zoned, there are 5,600 vacant developable lots in the district to meet a 20-year demand for 2,850 households, including holiday homes. I understand that Mr Council considers that the district's 10-year supply is only 2,200, with a demand over that period of 2,300 households, a shortfall of 100. He agrees that even at a high New Zealand Stats forecast for the 20-year time period, there will be demand for 4,300 households, including holiday homes, against a supply of 5,600 vacant lots. It's not clear on what basis Mr Council distinguishes his 10 and 20-year supply. There is agreement in the Economic Joint Witness Statement as to demand in the Southern Bays for some 210 to 300 lots over the next 30 years, based on a demand for 7 to 10 lots per annum. I understand there to be 198 vacant allotments in the Southern Bays, including 47 within the existing Whareroa settlement. With the addition of 160 allotments as a consequence of the plan change, this equates to a supply of 358 allotments. Based on a continuation of the current rates, this provides for some 35 to 51 years of supply, one in excess of the operative life of this district plan or indeed the next. I've outlined in my evidence in chief and rebuttal evidence that I consider the policy framework in the regional policy statement and district plan is not silent in terms of matters of urban supply. Ultimately, I do not consider that the provision of additional land at Whareroa North achieves the settled objectives of TDP, nor gives effect to those relevant provisions of the regional policy statement. In terms of geotechnical...
Sorry, I'm going to have to unfortunately interrupt you there, given the prior commitment I've discussed. So, panel members, are you happy to read to yourselves the remainder of this over lunch, or would you rather than Mr Bonus have read it out to us once we come back from lunch? And yeah, sure. Okay, so we'll panel members will read the rest of this over lunch, but obviously any interpolations or additional advice that you want to give us, you should give us that before we then turn to questions, if you're happy with that. So, and again, apologies, but when the Minister asks, you need to obey. So we'll adjourn now until probably about, hopefully, 1:20, 1:20-ish, 1:20, 1:25. Oh, 2:20, 2:25. Oh, it's 1 o'clock now, isn't it? So, yeah.